You think you know the vampire. You picture the seductive aristocrat, the tragic misunderstood hero wrapped in velvet and dark romance. That is the great lie of the modern age. The original cinematic vampire was not a lover. He was a plague. He was not an aristocrat. He was aligned with the rat, the era's emblem of pestilence. He was the physical, walking embodiment of the sickness that reduced cities to silent tombs. This is the darker lineage Hollywood largely softened over a century. Tonight, on Umbral Fables, we investigate the true, terrifying myth of the original vampire. We explore the 1922 masterpiece Nosferatu not as a simple horror film, but as a profound, dark document on mass hysteria, social decay, and the ancient folk terrors that inspired it. We will uncover the origins of the vampire myth, not in the castles of nobility, but in the shallow graves of the peasantry. This is the story of the Nachzehrer, the Shroud-Eater, and the philosophical dread that Hollywood found too terrifying to adapt. This is the original vampire, and his true nature is far worse than any romanticized fiction. To understand the profound, atmospheric dread of Nosferatu, we must first travel back to the fragile chaos of 1922 Germany. The Weimar Republic was a society psychologically shattered by the First World War, grappling with economic collapse and a pervasive sense of moral decay. It was in this atmosphere of societal dread that director F.W. Murnau created his masterpiece. Nosferatu, a symphony of horror, was intended to be an adaptation of Bram Stoker's Dracula, published just 25 years prior. However, Stoker's widow refused the rights, leading the filmmakers to change the names. Dracula became Count Orlok. But this legal necessity resulted in a profound philosophical split. Stoker's Dracula was an aristocrat, a count capable of navigating high society, possessing a dark predatory charm. Murnau's Count Orlok, however, is something far more primal and terrifying. He is not charming, he is grotesque by design. He does not blend in. He is framed by the era's anxieties as an outsider figure within the film's symbolism. His appearance, the bald head, the pointed ears, the elongated fingers, and the fangs positioned not as seductive canines but as rodent-like incisors, was a deliberate choice. Murnau was not filming a story of dark romance. He was filming the arrival of a consuming force. This is the central thesis Hollywood softened. The true horror of Nosferatu is not the symbolic removal of life essence from his victims. It is the swarm of rats that follows his arrival. He is the literal vector of the consuming sickness that depopulates the town of Visborg. The film visually equates the vampire with the rat, a period symbol of contamination and relentless consumption. In the 1920s, this was not a metaphor. It was a living memory of recent epidemics which had ravaged the world only years earlier. The vampire, in this original context, functions as a vector made flesh, an indifferent biological terror that cannot be reasoned with, seduced, or redeemed. It can only be survived, or failing that, endured as it leads to the town's near-systemic breakdown. This interpretation is far more intellectually terrifying than the modern, softened villain who conveniently falls in love. The horror is not that he desires you. The horror is that he sees you merely as sustenance. The figure of Count Orlok, the rat-like vampire of Nosferatu, was not a purely cinematic invention. It is, in fact, a far more faithful and terrifying representation of original European folklore than Bram Stoker's Dracula. Before the seductive aristocrat, the vampire myth was deeply rooted in the terror of disease, decomposition, and the primal fear of the grave. To understand Nosferatu, we must investigate the myth of the Nachzehrer, or Shroud-Eater. This myth, prevalent in Germanic and Slavic regions, was not about an immortal count. It was about the corpse of a recent plague victim, often patient zero, that refused to stay dead. Folklore maintained that these corpses, animated by a dark force or the disease itself, would remain in their coffins and begin to ritualistically consume their own burial shrouds. This symbolic act of consumption, performed from within the grave, was believed to be the cause of the consuming sickness in the world of the living. The Nachzehrer was thought to drain the vital force of its surviving relatives through this act. spreading the decay from within the tomb. This is the true origin of the vampire, as a drain on life. Orlok's visual appearance in Nosferatu, with his rodent-like teeth, perfectly echoes this myth. He is the consumer, the shroud chewer. When mass graves were reopened during past outbreaks, gravediggers often found corpses with the shrouds torn or partially disturbed, a natural result of decomposition. However, to the terrified and superstitious mind of the era, this was irrefutable proof of the Nachzehner's activity. The solution to this horror was not a wooden stake, it was an act of ritualistic prevention. Vampire hunters would place a brick or a stone in the corpse's mouth to physically stop it from chewing the shroud. This is the original vampire, not a creature of power and seduction, but a corpse-like figure driven by an impersonal biological impulse. The genius of Nosferatu was capturing this essence. The horror of Orlok is the horror of biological inevitability, the fear of the body that refuses to obey the laws of nature and instead becomes a vector for the community's annihilation. Murnau's film is a document about the terror of contamination. Bram Stoker's Dracula, published in 1897, was the event that softened this folklore. Stoker, a Victorian gentleman, took the biological horror of the Nachzehrer and dressed it in the trappings of Gothic aristocracy. The vampire ceased to be a diseased corpse in a village grave and became an immortal count in a decaying castle. This was a crucial philosophical shift. The horror was no longer disease, it was moral and symbolic corruption. Stoker's Dracula represents the Victorian fear of foreign influence and of rampant, predatory behavior. He does not drain life to spread plague. He drains life to corrupt purity. The act of biting the neck, which in Nosferatu is a predatory animalistic attack, in Dracula becomes an act of terrible transgression, loaded with symbolic violation. Stoker's genius was creating a monster that was simultaneously repulsive and deeply attractive. Count Dracula is eloquent, intelligent, and capable of manipulating high society. This makes him dangerous in a way the Nachzehrer was not. The Nachzehrer was a biological problem. Dracula is a moral and spiritual problem that requires the intervention of intellectual hunters and the purity of faith. Hollywood, understandably, embraced Stoker's version. The romantic, sexualized vampire proved far more marketable than the plague-born rat archetype. Murnau's Nosferatu remains a terrifying deviation, an anomaly that dared to show the older truth. The irony is that Murnau's version, forced by copyright issues, ended up being the more accurate folkloric adaptation. The film captures the true dread behind the myth, the fear of total annihilation, of the loss of identity not through seduction, but through indifferent disease. Stoker's vampire wants your soul. Murnau's vampire wants only your vitality, and the process turns you into nothing more than another statistic of the plague. This indifference is the true horror. The reception and legacy of Nosferatu are as dark as the film itself. Immediately upon its release, Bram Stoker's widow, Florence Stoker, sued the filmmakers for copyright infringement. She won the lawsuit. The court ordered that all copies of Nosferatu were to be destroyed. The film was designed to be erased from existence, a fate that was almost successful. It was only through a few smuggled copies, preserved in secret, that this masterpiece survived. The film, therefore, is literally a survivor, a piece of folklore rescued from legal suppression. This near destruction only reinforces the film's thesis, that the dark truth is often deemed too dangerous to be seen. Florence Stoker's legal action was not just procedural, it was philosophical. She was, in effect, trying to destroy the pestilent interpretation of the myth in order to preserve her husband's clean, aristocratic, and marketable version. She was protecting the softened commercial iteration of the myth. The visual legacy of Nosferatu proved unkillable. The image of Count Orlok, the stark shadow climbing the stairs, the clawed shadow grasping his victim's heart, became the visual archetype for cinematic horror. Murnau's film introduced the concept that the shadow of the monster is often more terrifying than the monster itself. He used light and darkness not just to illuminate, but to hide, creating an atmosphere of psychological dread. German Expressionism, of which Nosferatu is a pillar, taught the world that the set design and lighting should reflect the fractured mental state of the characters. The town of Visborg is not just a location, it is a character, a labyrinth of Gothic architecture that becomes a trap. Murnau's genius was to film the horror as an inevitable nightmare, a symphony of horror that unfolds with the cold, relentless logic of a terminal disease. The film offers not the hope of a climactic battle, but only the reality of contamination and the small, desperate hope of a final sacrifice. This is the legacy Hollywood actively tried to forget. Bram Stoker's sanitization of the vampire did not only apply to the Nachzehrer folklore, he also performed a profound philosophical cleansing on the historical figure who partially inspired his count. Vlad III of Wallachia, known posthumously as Vlad Tepes. This 15th century ruler was not a seductive aristocrat. He was a brutal military warlord whose reputation for severity was a calculated tool of psychological warfare and state control. Vlad's connection to vampirism is almost entirely a Western invention, but the fear he inspired was very real. The legend of Vlad Tepes did not involve mysticism. It involved a terrifying form of inescapable judgment. He was famous for his vast displays of impalements used as intimidation, leaving a visual warning of his absolute power. Sources, often propagandistic, describe macabre courtly displays following battles. This act was not vampirism. It was the ultimate demonstration of power, the power to symbolically consume the agency of his enemies. Stoker, while researching Dracula, encountered this figure and performed an act of literary transformation. He took the gritty political and military harshness of Vlad and translated it into a supernatural Gothic horror. Vlad's judgment, which was political, became Count Dracula's judgment, which is predatory and moral. Stoker removed the messy complexity of the history, the warfare, the political alliances, and replaced it with the clean narrative of a monster versus civilization. This is the great illusion of popular literature. They make us believe the monster is a supernatural entity, when, in reality, the original horror was entirely human. Vlad Tepes was terrifying not because he was a vampire, but because he was a man who wielded authority with absolute indifference. Murnau's Nosferatu, ironically, comes closer to Vlad's philosophy. Count Orlok, like Vlad, imposes a sentence upon communities. He arrives and delivers a fate, not out of rage or passion, but as an act of existence, a cold inevitability. The pestilence he brings is as impersonal and absolute as an invading army. The 1922 film captures the essence of political horror, the fear of an external, indifferent, and all-powerful force dismantling society from within. Stoker's sanitization gave the West a monster that could be fought with symbols of faith. The historical reality of Vlad offered a monster that could only be fought with cannons and armies. The most profound philosophical deviation in Nosferatu, and the element most thoroughly abandoned by Hollywood, is the role of its heroine, Ellen. In Stoker's Dracula, the women are often targets who succumb to the vampire's influence or survivors who must be rescued by the intellectual and spiritual power of men. The women are largely passive agents in a moral war fought by others. Murnau's Nosferatu rejects this entirely. Ellen is not a passive victim. She is the film's only true intellectual and spiritual protagonist. While the men of Visborg run around in chaos, failing to understand the scientific or mystical nature of the threat, Ellen studies the forbidden book of lore. She is the one who discovers the truth, that the vampire, the vector of the pestilence, can only be defeated by a woman pure in heart, who willingly offers her vitality to the monster, distracting it until the sun rises. This is a radical departure. The pure woman does not defeat the monster with external faith. She defeats it through an act of deliberate, conscious self-sacrifice, using her own spirit as a symbolic removal of the town's corruption. She doesn't fight the monster. She absorbs its darkness. Her sacrifice is not a passive act, but an active, intellectual strategy. She knowingly invites the presence into her room, fully aware of the fate that awaits her, in order to save the community that the men were powerless to protect. This makes Nosferatu a profoundly complex text, suggesting that the masculine forces of logic and industry are useless against a primal natural horror. It is an act of intuitive sacrifice that restores the natural order. Hollywood, of course, rejected this narrative. The trope of the male hero saving the damsel in distress was far more marketable. Nosferatu presents a bleaker, more complex truth, that the only way to defeat an overwhelming, indifferent force of nature is through an equally overwhelming, conscious act of selflessness. The true horror of Nosferatu lies in its cold biological heart. The film is a masterpiece of atmospheric dread, precisely because its monster operates with the indifference of a microbe. Unlike the modern vampire, Count Orlok has no internal conflict. He is not a tragic cursed soul brooding over his lost humanity. He is a conflictless predator, operating more as mechanism than character, driven by an ancient consuming hunger. This lack of psychology is his most terrifying feature. He embodies an impersonal consuming sickness, a primal force that acts according to its nature, without malice or morality. This biological dread is reinforced by the film's constant, obsessive visual pairing of Orlok with rats, vermin, and the twisted trees of his homeland. He is not separate from nature. He is the dark, pestilential essence of nature. The film's most chilling sequences are not the attacks, but the slow, silent scenes of Orlok's ship gliding into the harbor of Visborg, its hold filled with coffins of black earth and a swarm of vectors. The coffins are not beds. They are incubators. The ship is not a transport. It is a delivery system. This visual language, equating the vampire with an unstoppable infection, was a profound philosophical statement in 1922, striking at the core of a society still reeling from global pandemics. The fear was not of being seduced by a dark stranger, but of your neighbor suddenly collapsing from an invisible, incurable sickness. Nosferatu is a film about a public health anxiety refracted through Gothic horror aesthetics. The reason Hollywood softened this is that biological indifference is a terrifyingly nihilistic concept. It removes the comfort of a moral framework. There is no good versus evil in a plague. There is only the infected and the uninfected. By turning the vampire into a romantic anti-hero, Hollywood offered an escape. Nosferatu holds up a mirror. To fully dissect the intellectual horror of Nosferatu, we must confront its darkest, most disturbing truth. The film is a profound document of societal paranoia, and its monster is steeped in the visual language of its time. This is a critical layer that modern, market-friendly adaptations often refuse to acknowledge. In 1922, Weimar Germany, society was desperate for a scapegoat for its economic collapse and lingering anxieties. The other, the outsider, was often targeted as the source of this decay. Murnau's Count Orlok is the physical manifestation of this fear of the unknown. His appearance is not just monstrous, it is a grotesque visualization, rooted in caricatural features derived from period propaganda. Orlok is the ultimate intruder, framed as an outsider constructed by the era's anxieties about distant elsewheres, who arrives by ship to infiltrate the pure town. He mirrors, within the film's imagery, conspiracy myths of the era, explicitly critiqued here as prejudiced constructs. Nosferatu takes this metaphorical fear and makes it literal. Orlok brings a pestilence, a biological corruption that is visually and philosophically linked to his foreign nature. This is an uncomfortable and deeply disturbing truth, but it is essential to understanding the film's power. Nosferatu is not just a supernatural horror story. It is a sociological horror story about the mechanisms of blame. The monster is terrifying, not just for what he is, but for what he represents to the terrified populace. Hollywood's softening of the vampire, turning him into a handsome, assimilated aristocrat, is a deliberate flight from this ugly reality. The modern vampire is safe. Orlok is the terrifying original, the monster who is defined by his absolute, irreconcilable difference. Within the film's logic, he defies integration or negotiation. Only removal ends the vector. The film's ultimate resolution, Ellen's sacrifice, reinforces this. The town is not saved by fighting the monster, but by a pure soul absorbing its contamination, a symbolic act of self-purification. One of the greatest paradoxes of Nosferatu is that its most profound atmospheric achievements are auditory, even though it is a silent film. Murnau's genius was his ability to use visual language to imply sound, creating a psychological soundtrack of dread in the viewer's mind. The film's power does not come from what you see. It comes from what you imagine you hear. The slow, agonizing creak of the coffin lid opening in the ship's hold. The relentless, skittering movement of thousands of vermin across cobblestone. The unnatural silence of Orlok's shadow as it glides up the stairs. The hollow, whistling wind of the Carpathian Mountains. Murnau directs the audience's imagination, forcing us to fill the silence with our own worst fears. This technique is infinitely more terrifying than the modern reliance on the jump scare. The modern horror film uses sudden loud noises to startle the audience, a cheap biological reflex. Nosferatu uses its oppressive, relentless silence to build a pervasive intellectual dread. The horror is not a momentary shock. It is a sustained, suffocating atmosphere. The film's symphony of horror is not literal music. It is the symphony of implied natural sounds that signify decay and the monster's approach. This focus on atmosphere is another element Hollywood has abandoned. The modern vampire film is loud. It is filled with action and dramatic scores that tell the audience exactly what to feel. Nosferatu offers no such comfort. Its silence is cold, objective, and indifferent, mirroring the biological indifference of the pestilence itself. The film's most terrifying moments are its quietest. Orlok standing perfectly still in a doorway, a black silhouette against the gray dawn. In this silence, the audience is forced to confront the monster on their own terms. This minimalist, atmospheric approach is intellectually demanding. Nosferatu's silence trails a plague. It is the sound of the grave. It is the sound of a world where the supernatural has broken through, and all the noise of human civilization is powerless to stop it. The lore of Nosferatu and its source, Dracula, contains a core philosophical concept that is almost entirely ignored by modern market-friendly archetypes, the concept of native soil. The vampire cannot rest unless surrounded by the earth of his homeland, forcing Orlok to transport his coffins, filled with the unhallowed earth of his castle, on the ship to Visborg. This is not merely a plot device or a peculiar weakness. It is a profound mythological statement. It signifies that the monster is not a global, independent entity. He is an extension of the land itself. He is bound to his past, to the soil that created him. The darkness is territorial. The coffins of earth are, in essence, mobile pieces of his homeland, acting as anchors for his unnatural power. This concept is a terrifying metaphor for the persistence of the past and the inescapability of one's origins. Orlok is not just a man. He is the physical manifestation of the ancient superstitious land he comes from. He brings his sickness with him because he is the sickness of that soil. This idea is intellectually terrifying. It suggests that the threat is not just an act, but a place. Hollywood, in its pursuit of the globalized romantic vampire, completely abandoned this. The modern vampire is a citizen of the world. He travels from New Orleans to Paris, lives in slick modern apartments, and is entirely disconnected from his origins. This softening makes the monster manageable. If the vampire is just a person with a curse, he can be cured or redeemed. But if the vampire is the literal embodiment of a cursed earth, the problem is far more profound. How do you defeat a landscape? Nosferatu suggests you cannot. The monster's power is as deep as the grave. This concept also reinforces the film's darker subtexts. The imported native soil functions as a portable contagion metaphor within the myth. The arrival of Orlok's coffins is an act of terraforming the town of Visborg, turning the healthy land into a corrupted extension of his own diseased homeland. The drama is not one of man versus monster, but of one territory versus another. Ellen understands this. Her sacrifice is not just to neutralize Orlok, but to cleanse the land by exposing the foreign vector to the purifying light of the sun. The ultimate philosophical horror of Nosferatu is its cold, unflinching depiction of the vampire as a biological absolute. Count Orlok is not a character in the traditional sense. He is a mechanism. He is the engine of the pestilence, a creature operating on a singular base imperative: consumption. This lack of psychology, this complete void of internal conflict, is what makes him the most terrifying vampire in cinematic history. The defanged and romanticized version of the vampire found in modern media is a creature of tragic romance, defined by his lost humanity, his angst, and his complex relationships. This makes him understandable. It gives the audience a psychological foothold, a way to relate to, and even pity the monster. This is a profound comfort. Nosferatu offers no such comfort. Orlok is entirely unrelatable. He is a radically othered figure, grotesque by design, an entity that is biologically and philosophically incompatible with the human world. He does not desire love, power, or redemption. He desires sustenance, and his existence is a direct causal link to the dissolution of the society he infiltrates. This is the truth Hollywood softened, the terror of complete biological indifference. The film argues that the most terrifying monster is not the one that hates you, but the one that does not even register your humanity. To Orlok, the citizens of Visborg are not souls to be corrupted. They are simply a resource, a harvest. This aligns perfectly with the ancient terror of the Nachzehrer. This biological horror is far more nihilistic than the moral horror of Dracula. A moral horror implies a cosmic framework of good and evil. Nosferatu presents a world where morality is irrelevant. There is no good or evil in a plague. There is only the vector and the victim. This cold, almost scientific depiction of the supernatural is the film's greatest intellectual achievement. It removes the comfort of religion and philosophy, leaving only the stark, terrifying reality of a natural disaster. The final devastating verdict delivered by Nosferatu lies in its portrayal of human impotence in the face of this indifference. The film is a symphony of failure. The men of Wisborg, the leaders, the scientists, the businessmen, are rendered utterly useless by Orlok's arrival. Their tools of civilization, logic, commerce, law, are completely ineffective against a threat that operates outside of that system. They spend the film running in circles, misdiagnosing the problem, and attempting to apply rational solutions to an irrational, elemental force. The town's descent into near-systemic breakdown is a direct result of this failure of the civilized mind to comprehend the primal, ancient horror that has invaded it. This is a profound critique of the arrogance of the modern industrial world, a theme that resonates deeply with the anxieties of the Weimar Republic. The society that believed it had mastered the world through science and industry is brought to its knees by a creature arriving on a primitive tide of rats. The film argues that civilization is a fragile, thin veneer, easily shattered by the return of ancient primal fears. The only character who understands this is Ellen. She does not try to fight the monster with human tools. She recognizes it as a force of nature and understands that it must be answered not with violence, but with a sacrifice that completes a dark, natural cycle. Her pure heart is not a moral statement, but a biological one. She offers herself as the final lure, a symbolic removal of the town's collective sickness, inviting the creature into the one trap it cannot escape: the sun. The sun's destruction of Orlok is not a victory of good over evil. It is the precedence of one natural force, light, over another, plague, darkness. The film's ending is not a triumph. It is a grim, biological equation. This philosophical pessimism is the final truth that Hollywood, with its obsession with heroic agency and triumphant third acts, cannot tolerate. This leads us to the fundamental question of why the softening occurred in the first place. Why did Western culture collectively and deliberately choose the romantic fiction over the atmospheric truth? The answer lies deep in the psychology of the audience and our collective refusal to confront mortality. The vampire you see today, the romantic, brooding anti-hero, is a comfortable commercial construct designed to soothe, not to terrify. It is the softened, market-friendly archetype of a myth that was born from humanity's deepest and most primal fears. The fear of rotting disease, the silence of the mass grave, and the dread of an indifferent, consuming nature. The original vampire was the grotesque horror of the body itself, the biological engine of the pestilence that could not be reasoned with. The cinematic original, Count Orlok, embodies an impersonal, consuming sickness, an indifferent, rat-like invader, an inescapable judgment delivered not by a moral god, but by a chaotic force of nature. Nosferatu is a philosophical document, a dark mirror held up to a society terrified of its own fragility, its own prejudices, and its own impotence against an invisible enemy. Hollywood and popular literature took this profound biological and sociological horror and filtered it through the lens of ego. They replaced the rat with the aristocrat, the plague with passion, and the biological indifference with tragic romance. They gave us a monster we could understand, pity, and even desire, effectively neutering the threat. It conceals the harsher terror, a monster that does not register our humanity. By turning the vampire into a figure of desire, we reclaimed power over the fear of death. If the monster wants us, we matter. If the monster is just a disease, we are nothing. The choice to romanticize the vampire is a collective psychological defense mechanism against the nihilism of the original myth, a way to pretend that death has a face and a name, rather than being a silent, creeping shadow. The journey of the vampire myth, from the shallow grave of the folklore victim to the velvet-lined coffin of the Hollywood star, is a story of cultural displacement and the evolution of fear aesthetics. It is the story of a society deliberately choosing a comfortable fiction over a terrifying, complex truth. This is the dark legacy that Nosferatu, in its silent, shadowy perfection, preserves for the modern viewer. It reminds us that civilization is a thin, fragile veneer, easily disrupted by the return of ancient primal forces that do not respect our borders or our laws. The film's ultimate lesson is that the universe is not hostile. It is simply indifferent, and that indifference is the most terrifying monster of all. The visual language of the film, the shadow of the hand grasping the heart, the silhouette rising stiffly from the coffin, established the grammar of horror cinema forever. But where modern films use these images for shock value or aesthetic coolness, Murnau used them for philosophy. The shadow is not just a scare tactic. It is a metaphysical statement that the reach of the pestilence extends far beyond its physical presence, touching everything in its path before the source is even seen. The sanitization of the myth was a necessary commercial evolution, a way to sell the darkness back to an audience that wanted to be thrilled, not traumatized by the reality of their own mortality. But the shadow of Orlok remains, a persistent reminder that some fears cannot be romanced away. The aesthetic of Nosferatu, the grainy, high-contrast nightmare, feels more honest than the glossy, high-definition vampires of today because it acknowledges the grit and the dirt of the grave. The resurgence of Nosferatu's core theme, the vampire as pestilence, is profoundly relevant today, perhaps more than at any time since 1922. In an era defined by global anxieties about health, contagion, and the terrifying speed at which an invisible agent can disrupt the entire machinery of civilization, Murnau's masterpiece feels less like a vintage horror film and more like a historical documentary of future fear. The true horror of Nosferatu is its depiction of a society's total, systemic collapse in the face of an invisible, indifferent threat. The scenes of Wisborg descending into chaos, the fear in the streets, the paranoia of the neighbors, the marking of doors with crosses, the desperate and useless actions of the town's leaders, are a chilling mirror to historical and modern crises. The film captures the terrifying reality that our complex social structures are incredibly fragile and can be undone by a single vector. Count Orlok is the perfect metaphor for a novel contagion. He arrives from a distant land, travels silently via modern transport networks, and infiltrates the community before his presence is even fully understood. His first victims are dismissed as anomalies, and by the time the authorities recognize the pattern, the situation is already critical and the systems are failing. This reading elevates Nosferatu from a simple monster movie to a profound philosophical text on the nature of societal vulnerability. It argues that the greatest threat is not a singular, identifiable monster that can be shot, but a systemic, consuming sickness that turns the systems of civilization against themselves, isolating individuals and breaking the bonds of community. The final verdict is clear. Nosferatu remains the superior, darker text because it refuses to offer the audience the comfort of agency or false hope. In the modern myth, you can fight the vampire, you can outsmart him, or you can join him. In Nosferatu, you can only survive him or sacrifice yourself to stop the spread. This bleakness is what makes it a masterpiece of dark storytelling. It forces us to confront the reality that there are forces in this world, biological, societal, and natural, that do not negotiate. The film is a warning from the past, echoing the anxieties of a world on the brink of change, a warning that resonates just as loudly today. The true vampire is not the man in the cape. The true vampire is the silence that trails a plague. Hollywood often offered escape, creating worlds where heroes win and monsters are defeated by rules. Nosferatu holds up a mirror to our powerlessness. It forces us to look at the rat, the shadow, and the disease, and recognize them not as foreign invaders, but as integral parts of the natural world we try so hard to ignore. The romantic vampire tells us that love conquers death. The original vampire tells us that death is an inevitable, impersonal machine. One is a beautiful lie, the other is the cold truth. True horror does not comfort, it disturbs. It does not reassure us of our power, it reminds us of our fragility. Nosferatu performs this function perfectly, stripping away the romantic illusions of the genre to reveal the skeleton beneath. The final inescapable verdict of this investigation is that Nosferatu remains the superior, darker, and infinitely more necessary text because it refuses to offer the audience the modern comfort of agency. In the modern myth, the narrative is designed to empower the viewer. You can fight the vampire with weapons, you can outsmart him with logic, or you can join him through seduction. The power dynamic is balanced. In Nosferatu, the power dynamic is devastatingly realistic. You can only survive him or sacrifice yourself to stop the spread. This bleakness is what makes it a masterpiece of dark storytelling. It forces us to confront the reality that there are forces in this world, biological, societal, and natural, that do not negotiate, do not feel pity, and cannot be romanced. The film is a warning from the past, echoing the anxieties of a world on the brink of change, a warning that resonates just as loudly today in our own era of uncertainty. The true vampire is not the man in the cape who seeks a bride. The true vampire is the silence that trails a plague, the empty street and the closed door. Hollywood often offered escape, presenting horror as a thrill ride where the safety bar is always locked. Nosferatu holds up a mirror to our fragility. It forces us to look at the rat, the shadow, and the disease, and recognize them not as foreign invaders to be banished, but as integral, terrifying parts of the natural world we try so hard to ignore. The romantic vampire tells us that love conquers death. The original vampire tells us that death is an inevitable, impersonal machine that eventually processes us all. One is a beautiful lie designed to sell tickets. The other is the cold truth designed to haunt your sleep. This distinction brings us to the core mission of our investigation. We do not look into the dark simply to be frightened. We look to understand the mechanisms of our own fear. The sanitization of the vampire is not just a change in movie trends. It is a symptom of a culture that is slowly losing its ability to grapple with difficult, complex truths. By turning our monsters into heroes, we deprive ourselves of the ability to face the monstrous. We forget what true horror looks like, and in doing so, we leave ourselves psychologically unprepared when the real shadows lengthen across history. Nosferatu stands as a monument to the era before the softening, a testament to a time when art dared to look directly into the abyss of human helplessness and found a strange, terrible beauty in the tragedy of the species. The image of Count Orlok, stiff and corpse-like, standing in the window frame, is not just an icon of cinema. It is a reminder of the pestilence that always waits at the edge of civilization. To watch this film today is to participate in a ritual of remembrance, acknowledging the fears of our ancestors, fears that we have buried under layers of CGI and romance, but which have never truly gone away. The Umbral Fables project exists to excavate these buried fears, to scrape away the layers of modern polish, and to reveal the raw, uncomfortable archetypes that lie beneath. We believe that the oldest myths are the truest maps of the human psyche. As we close the book on the Nachzehrer and the legacy of Murnau, we must ask ourselves why we are drawn back to this specific darkness. Perhaps it is because in a world of curated images and filtered realities, the stark, grainy black and white honesty of Nosferatu feels more real than the high-definition fantasies we are fed daily. The film does not ask you to like the monster, it asks you to witness him. It demands a level of intellectual and emotional engagement that is rare in modern entertainment. It asks you to sit with the discomfort, to endure the silence, and to accept the lack of a happy ending. This is the discipline of true horror. It is an intellectual exercise in facing the worst-case scenario and finding the strength to keep watching. The shadow of the vampire has stretched across a century, touching every generation that has lived in fear of the unseen contagion. It is a shadow that will likely stretch for another century, changing shape but never losing its essential consuming nature. We are the current custodians of this fear, and how we choose to tell these stories, whether we choose the lie or the truth, defines who we are. If this deep exploration into the true, dark heart of the vampire myth resonated with you, and if you believe that the history of horror is a history of human truth, then you are in the right place. We are building an archive of the shadows that history and Hollywood tried to bury. This channel is dedicated to the unsanitized, the complex, and the profound. We need you to join this investigation. Leave a comment below with your analysis. Do you believe the modern romantic vampire has destroyed the genre, or is it a necessary evolution? Which other dark myth or folkloric monster do you believe Hollywood has softened the most? Your insights and your engagement are what keep this project alive. Your support keeps the shadows long and the investigations deep. Subscribe to Umbral Fables to ensure you do not miss the next chapter of our descent into the hidden history of folklore. We will continue to peel back the layers of the comfortable lies to find the cold, hard truths waiting underneath. This is Umbral Fables. We leave you now, not with a conclusion, but with a reflection on the original plague. The screen may go dark, but the shadow remains. Look closely. The dark journey continues.